thanks so much for joining the podcast today, Sui Lang. I really appreciate your joining us.
My pleasure, Jeff. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, I'm excited for the conversation today because I talk to a lot of lending executives, but we don't talk to a lot of people about other topics in banking. This is one that I think is really interesting. So can you tell me a little bit before we get started just about Zions Bank and your role there in DEI? Because I think that's not, it's a really interesting role to me to see how you define what it is and what it means in the context of the bank.
Yeah, sure, Jeff. And just a little bit about my professional background. My background is actually in the political arena. Most of the diversity, equity, inclusion work that I have done has been with political leaders, diversifying political leadership and also democratizing the media landscape, so amplifying the voices of women, people of color in the local and mainstream media. I do not have a financial services background. However, it works well because I work with a lot of people who do. and a lot of people at the bank don't have my skill set. And so together we kind of partner and we complement one another to build out what we hope will be a successful diversity, equity, inclusion strategy. So we step into Zions Bank coming from a social, racial, economic justice background. So I do this work because people's livelihood and lives depend on it. Generally, sometimes in the private sector, the perception can be different. Right? Corporations only get on board when it impacts their bottom line. I'm happy to report to you that Zions Bank comes at this with a completely different approach. They've been doing diversity, equity, inclusion since inception. And in 2 years, Zions Bank will celebrate our 150th anniversary. So clearly, leadership knows how to build a profitable and sustainable business. It's truly an honor to be associated with the Zions Bank brand. And the work that we do here is absolutely timely for the industry. And to go back to my role here and what the purpose is, what we're here to do is to champion economic inclusion. There's a very specific role that banks and financial institutions play in the bigger picture of achieving true equality in America. And again, that is building economic inclusion. And what we're socializing here is building economic inclusion by opening opportunity, increasing access, and investing our capital. When we say capital, we mean three things. Number one, human capital, our people. Number two, social capital, the relationships, the trust that we build amongst our teams, with our clients, and ultimately in the community. And thirdly, financial capital, which is our monetary investments. So if we can do all of those things successfully, we will be successful in building economic inclusion.
I want to get back to your definition of economic inclusion and how you think about that, but I want to take a step back because we had talked about your background a little bit before we started, and you were telling me what brought you, what brings someone out of the social justice world into the banking world, what attracted you to this role in this institution, because it's not an obvious next step for someone who was doing what you were doing.
Agreed, and thank you so much for that question. I always tell people I accepted this offer, and also I guess it's notable to note that Zions Bank found me in the community. They had reached out to me within 1 week. It was September of last year. I had 3 organizations in Utah reach out to me, strongly encouraging me to apply for these roles. They were all leadership roles, leading their DEI efforts in pretty well-known and established organizations here in the state of Utah. And quickly, Zions Bank became my number one. I became their number one. I officially started in this role December of 2020. So I just celebrated my 7-month anniversary, but thrilled and excited about the work that we've already accomplished so far here at Zions Bank. But I accepted this offer for 3 reasons. Number one, opportunity to work with Scott Anderson. Scott Anderson was our president and CEO. He is one of the greatest DEI champions I have ever personally and professionally worked with. He is a unicorn. Number two, an opportunity to do diversity, equity, inclusion work in the financial services industry. And again, going back to the whole where we are at 2021, the specific role that banks play in that broader picture of achieving true equality in America. And number three, an opportunity to work with white men specifically. A lot of my work in Washington was working with women and communities of color, getting the, and really moving the needle on public policy, recognizing the impact that public policy has on our daily lives, right? And kind of shifting culture and policy so that we can, again, create broader opportunity and more equality, equity, all of those good things across America so that we can truly be proud of who we are as Americans and live out our fundamental principles and values here. And so in doing so, that is, I feel like my background and the work that I've done in the political arena really lends itself to the DEI space and also in the corporate sector, especially in an industry like banking and finance. Because politics is all about building social capital, right? And leveraging your financial capital to achieve certain outcomes. And I would argue currently right now in the industry and across America, social capital needs to be at the forefront of everything that we do, because I feel like that's the area that we are lacking, right? There's a lot of distrust that exists amongst different industries, different subgroups, different even leaders, right? And so it's really important to find ways to build trust across differences, build bridges, alignment, alliances, things like that, so that we can really create opportunities for all Americans to thrive.
How do you think about the building trust within the community? I mean, it seems like a central tenet of your work is around trust and building trust. I know we've spoken about that earlier, but I'd love for you to delve into a little bit of how you think about the ways one actually builds trust with the community and how different people can be important in your efforts to do that.
That's a great question. And, people trust people who they know are going to show up, right? They don't just show up when it's going to work, it's going to benefit them, right? It's important to, another part of the concepts that we roll out here is threefold in terms of our philosophy and our approach to rolling out our diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Is number one, I listen, right? Number two, I learn. And number three, I lead. So it's important to do those things in that order. And in my experience, that is when individuals and organizations are successful at building trust. So you first listen with a sincere desire to understand, right? That builds empathy and understanding. And then you learn, okay, everyone can learn something from someone else. There's not just, no one has the, what do you call it? No one has the franchise on knowledge, right? I mean, we can learn from it. Some people might have other degrees from others, more experience in this particular field, but everyone brings perspectives and experiences to the table that are highly valuable, right, to any organization when developing their products and services. So it's important to place value on perceptions and experiences, as well as academic background, experience, things like that. And then the I lead, so it's important to listen first, then learn, and then lead out on whatever initiatives or missions, that you may be pushing forward as an organization. Everyone is a member of the DEI team here at Zions Bank. Everyone is a diversity inclusion champion. And so it takes a whole. And then in addition to that, building trust, we spoke about this a little bit earlier, but we talk about it in terms of building circles of trust. There are micro circles, and then there are macro circles of trust. So all of Zions Bank is one big macro circle of trust. The way that you strengthen the macro version is by successfully building micro circles of trust first. And just as an individual, Jeff, let me just personally ask you, what does your inner circle of trust look like? Is it 5 people? Is it 500 people?
My inner circle of trust?
Your inner
circle.
circle.
If I don't say it's just my wife, I'm going to get in trouble when she listens to the podcast. So I'm going to go with my wife. She listens to these. So my wife is my inner circle of trust. And then, I'd say my inner circle of trust, well, it's got to be a handful of people, right, that you just could absolutely count on, depend on, and trust kind of without question.
Exactly. So trust starts at a very small, intimate, micro level. And as we grow those circles of trust, that's how you can be successful in building that macro circle of trust. But it starts at the individual level, 3, 4, 5 people, and then expands into hundreds, thousands, sometimes millions.
I love this listen, learn, lead framework. I think that's really interesting. It reminds me actually a lot. My wife was in medical school. Since we brought up my wife, I'll bring this up. But they had a teaching methodology they called see one, do one, teach one. Like, if you were going to learn a procedure, you would see it done once, you would do it, and then you would teach someone to do it. And that's when you knew it, when you could teach it. And I thought that was a great framework. And this feels similar. You're kind of listening, you're learning, you're leading. Do you use that in the context of training programs? Is that a personal thing? Like, how does that really play out practically in the way you think about the programs you're rolling out at Zions, or the way you actually implement DEI, or any? It feels like it's not DEI specific, right? This is a general framework for some of these kinds of learnings and leadings. But I'm curious how that actually, displays itself in the work that you do.
Yeah, a couple of things. Well, all of the above that you just outlined. It is used to inform our engagement, our communication, our leadership development, resources that we develop here at the programs. Also wanted to go back to something you also stated, this may not be DEI. It absolutely is DEI. Diversity, equity, inclusion, what's most important for organizations to understand is really examining how you first define it, right? Diversity is defined by our differences, right? The differences that exist in any organization, and that includes race, gender, socioeconomic status, but also includes leadership style, personality, are you an introvert, extrovert, cultural backgrounds, regional differences, religious differences, political affiliation. All of those things contribute to the overall diversity of any given organization. And then our inclusion is defined by our culture, right? The manner in which we conduct ourselves. What is acceptable, what is unacceptable here at Zions Bank. And that's all determined by our people, right? The behaviors that we use and what is considered to be Zion's way, if you will. And the equity tool is, I describe that is really reflected in our values. And that is much more deeply reflected in the manner in which we do business. It's the integrity. It's the trust, the honesty, transparency, accuracy, all of those things, and trying to be as objective as possible, creating a space where all people feel like they belong, they are valued, they are heard, and also supported. And so that is what's going to result in what we call a high-performance organization. I have this other thing called the DEI equation that I've implemented here, and it's basically diversity times people plus your environment or culture times inclusion equals a high-performance organization. And high-performance organizations are successful at achieving results. And as I mentioned earlier, our ultimate goal here at Zions Bank is to build economic inclusion. And we do so by capitalizing on the full value of our human capital. That's what DEI is about, is really capitalizing on the full value of your human capital. I'm the people person. So any aspect of your business that has to do with people, that's DEI, right? Yeah. DEI isn't that program set aside for women and people of color. No, it's for all employees and needs to be deeply integrated into the business strategy in order to be successful and sustainable.
Yeah, that's a great transition, because one of the things that I was curious about in terms of your role, but just how you think about DEI broadly within the bank, is this kind of, there's, I imagine, internal focuses on employees and culture and diversity. There's can be a focus on having maybe a more diverse customer base or the kinds of communities that you're serving, and also the accessibility of different banking products to those communities. And I just really was curious your thoughts on how you think about those different layers of what you're focused on in DEI, how you impact each, or where you spend the majority of your time, because it feels like there's a lot of places that you can focus and a lot of things to think about when it comes to making sure we're really being equitable and inclusive as an institution.
Yeah, Jeff, and you're absolutely right. Internal and there needs to be two separate strategies, an internal focus and an external focus. In the banking industry, I would argue the external strategy is most important, because banks don't operate internally, they operate externally. And so you could have the healthiest, most thriving internal culture. If you're not doing what you need to do in the community with your clients, opening opportunity and access to capital, you're not necessarily, you're definitely not building economic inclusion. For once, you need to go back and rethink your strategy. But for my role, we have this thing called the 5 pillars. The first 3 pillars are primarily focused on our internal efforts. And I would say my role here at the bank is overwhelming. Majority of it is focused internally. My role is to drive and shift culture, so that we have a culture in which employees can perform at their best. And that's when employees feel heard, seen, valued, and supported. That's when we perform at our best. So the first three pillars are: number one, we have a One Zions DEI Council that's made up of leadership across the bank's footprint, and the Zions Bank Corporation, which we refer to as the enterprise footprint. Each of our business lines are represented in that council. We meet monthly to talk about high-level, big-picture strategy. The second one is our employee business forums. We have 9 of them, and each of them are led by employees who identify as being a member or an ally of any given specific group or community. Each of those employee business forums are also paired with an executive sponsor from our C-suite, and the executive sponsor's role is not to lead these groups. It is to serve as a support. To be there to kind of leverage whatever resources are needed, communicate back to the One Zions DEI Council what is happening in them, and so forth. The third pillar is our inclusion champions. So Zions Bank is divided up into 10 regions. Each of those regions is led by a regional executive management committee. We've also identified inclusion champions in each region that sit on these executive committees. And their role is to really customize and localize our DEI programming for that particular region. What's going to be successful in Sun Valley, Idaho is going to be vastly different from what's going to be successful in St. George, Utah. And so it's really important to make sure everything is customized and localized to have a more, the most successful, deepest impact in those communities that we serve. So those are our internal efforts. We've also launched speaker series that has been wildly successful, hosting panel conversations with community leaders and Zions Bank leaders on a whole host of topics that are relevant to building up our strategy. We also launched a One Zions mental health initiative as well back in February. Scott Anderson wanted to make mental health top priority here at Zions Bank in 2021 and beyond. Obviously it's a hot topic for so many organizations coming out of the pandemic. And so the One Zions, our mental health initiative is threefold. Well, actually has 4 components. We offer weekly meditation sessions. Number 2, we started a book club, which is a combination between a podcast, a think tank, and a book club. We meet monthly. We're using the book Believe in People by Charles Koch and Brian Hooks. I encourage everyone out there listening, pick up this book. This is probably the most, especially for the banking financial services industry, because everyone knows who Charles Koch is, right?
For anybody who'd just say, I recommend everybody. What was the name of the book and the author again? So I got to put this on my Amazon list, but remind me again what that was for everybody.
The name of the book is Believe in People.
Believe in People.
Yep. Okay. Charles Koch of Koch brothers, the Koch industry. Koch Industries, you're probably familiar with the organization. Number 2, largest publicly traded company in America. And then Brian Hooks, he partnered with him as well. But they highlight diversity, equity, and inclusion across the landscape, highlighting what he describes social entrepreneurs. And the concept of the book is really empowering people from the bottom up is what's going to create a transformative organization that's really going to impact communities and solve our nation's most pressing problems. So it is a wonderful diversity, equity, and inclusion book. If any of you want to start book club at your bank, highly recommend. And then we
book
also
club here, so I'm going to have to bring that one into the book club here at Upstart for that. I like that.
Awesome. And then we host quarterly mental health conversations on a wide range of topics based on employees' interest and need. And then the 2 final pillars that are our external outreach. Number 4 is our access to credit. It's our products and services, how we design those, how are we opening opportunity and access to communities who have historically been denied opportunity and access, and how can we put capital in the hands of these individuals and businesses so that our entire community can thrive, right? And Zions Bank just launched what we call our Small Business Diversity Banking Program. It's designed to invest and grow women-owned, ethnic minority-owned, and veteran-owned businesses. So we encourage you to check that out. And then the 5th pillar is our community investments. And as you mentioned earlier, Jeff, investing in the community is top priority here at Zions Bank. We pride ourselves in calling ourselves a community bank who has served the community for almost 150 years. And when you go back to the trust piece we were talking about earlier, look at what the organization has done in the community. And that's how you know they can be trusted, right? Is your organization building a high trust brand? Do members of the community trust your brand to take care of them, to be there for them, to come to their aid? Do you put people first, right? These are the questions in the minds of people in our communities.
How do you think about measuring that? I mean, I love the concept of trust. And I think if anything in my conversations with bankers, this message of trust is maybe the most important coin of the realm in terms of the value we can actually have for the long-term health of the bank. I hear that over and over again, but I'm always curious, how do you think about measuring what you're doing? Is it delivering trust? What can we do to improve the level of trust? It seems like a challenging thing to measure and then figure out how to actually impact other than through intuitive ways of like, I think this, people must like this. But how do you go about measuring and being kind of quantitative in your approach to that question?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we do conduct a lot of surveys, and I'm a big champion of measuring impact, and that's our ultimate goal is impact, right? By using quantitative and qualitative data. And just as you say, it's difficult to measure trust, right? On a scale of 1 to 10, I mean, you could ask the question, but, it's tough to measure the soft impact that we're having, right? Describe the relationships that we have built, how people feel about the organization. You can only go so far with that with the quantitative data. But the data always tells a story, but it never tells the full story. And so it's important to engage in conversations with members of the community, hear their personal stories, highlight testimonials, success stories with businesses who have been granted a PPP loan right this past year, and that has literally saved their business, saved their lives in many cases. So many of these small business owners have invested their entire lives in their businesses. These are family businesses. And the pandemic just wiped them out. Had they not received the PPP loan that they've gotten, they would have had to close their doors. And so there are numerous circumstances in which Zions Bank and so many other banks out there as well have come to their aid and helped keep those businesses alive. But another thing to gauge how well members of the community trust you is, who do they go to, right? Who are your go-to people in times of need? And I can absolutely attest to this. Zions Bank has been serving, all aspects of our community for so long. We are generally one of the pillars in the community that people turn to for support, for aid, for leadership, for vision, direction, all of those things. And so, and again, I can't take credit for all this. I just joined the bank. I'm very fortunate to have been able to step into an existing high trust organization, brand, network of committed individuals who are sincerely just so all about helping people. And that sits at the core of any diversity, equity, inclusion, any successful diversity, equity, inclusion program, strategy, plan, whatever you want to call it. You have to care about people genuinely. And if that is the case, you will be successful.
I like that. So I want to go back. I feel terrible because I feel like we've been having this whole conversation. You started off by saying, the most important concept for you overall and what kind of brought you into banking was this idea of economic inclusion and increasing the degree of it. And we didn't explore kind of what you mean by that, how you measure that, how you think about what the bank can do in practical terms to improve. So I'd love to delve into that topic. I think it's a wonderful phrase. It's near and dear to our hearts here at Upstart. Our mission statement was to enable access to credit, to broaden access to credit. Really what brought us into the world was a belief that many people were credit worthy and yet not understood to be so. So this idea of being more inclusive economically it's kind of where we came from. But I'd love to get your point of view on what that really means, how you think about measuring progress towards a more economically inclusive society, and what practically, Zions or for our listeners that their banks, what can a bank do to really improve the economic inclusivity in their communities?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the question. Now, when I first started in this role, what we initially did as a bank was we were a founding signatory of what we call the Utah Compact on Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And it was signed by Governor Herbert at the time, right before we had that transition. The administration transitioned into the Cox administration. And so that was one of the final documents that he signed as governor. We hosted a press release up on Capitol Hill and encouraged other community organizations, businesses, community leaders to sign onto this compact. In the compact outlines a set of values, right, that we are hoping we can foster across the Beehive State that will get all people on board in helping us build economic inclusion. One bank, one organization, one government cannot do this alone. We need all hands on deck to be committed, not just for the next 4 years, but for a long-term sustainable future, right? So we need to be all in for that long haul, if you will. So it starts there. In addition to that, there were 4 policy priorities that were outlined in the compact that we believe are essential in being successful at building economic inclusion. And they are education, employment, housing, and healthcare. And so it's not just about throwing money at the problem. And here, I'm just going to give the small business owner a loan, and boom, that's economic inclusion. We have to look at barriers, and oftentimes systemic barriers, that have kept individuals in our communities from being successful business owners, successful just professionals, successful leaders in their homes, in their communities, in the workplace, and start there. And education is one of those. So increasing access to education, removing barriers to pursuing education, healthcare, just coming out of the pandemic. Oh my gosh, that is top of mind. It just takes one disastrous terminal disease, one case of COVID-19 to completely end an entire family's economic situation, right? Or completely transform it, can end people's economic livelihood. So easy. And so healthcare is another piece of that. Housing. I mean, people need to have a roof over their head for them to even care about anything else. How can we address our homeless population, people who are experiencing homelessness in our communities? How can we support them and turn their road, right, or their pathway into something positive, get them on the right path, and then ultimately employment. I mean, we have Utah and Idaho, the strongest economies in the nation, the lowest percentage of unemployment rates, right? On the surface, if you look at that data alone, we're doing very well. Zions Bank, one thing Zions Bank, but it's important to also note and to never forget the people who are not included in those statistics. And that's one thing I love about Scott Anderson. No matter how well we may be doing as a community or a state or whatever, economically, he never forgets the little guy, the little girl, or those individuals or communities that are still struggling. We will never leave them behind. And it's so important to always keep them included, because it isn't until all individuals can thrive that we all thrive, right? That we're really being successful in building this economic inclusion. So it's a myriad of ways and it's going to take all hands on deck.
Absolutely. So I've got one more immediate question for myself that I have for you versus for the listeners, but maybe it's useful for them as well. But you had mentioned your employee groups internally. We have a similar structure, and I have ended up as the raised my hand to be the executive sponsor of our African American employee resource group. And to your point, I don't lead the group. I'm the executive sponsor. But what is your advice? I sometimes feel very cognizant that I'm not clearly a member of the group. I don't identify as African American. which I don't think is problematic, but I would love your advice on what I can do to be the most effective sponsor for that group, because I really want to make sure that I'm providing the most value I can in that role, and I'm sometimes at a loss for what I can do in that role. So I would love your advice for those of us who are, not in that community, but trying to be the most helpful we can, particularly in the context of some of these, company structures that are trying to support different communities.
That is such a beautiful question, and I love that you guys have set up that employee resource group at your organization. I'm actually going to use an example, a real personal, and professional story here at Zions Bank. We also have a Black/African American employee business forum, and our executive sponsor is also a white male. And he has done a phenomenal job as serving as an ally and a partner in this work. His name is Rob Bruff. And I describe Rob Bruff as our number 3 here at the bank. We've got number 1, Scott Anderson, the CEO. Number 2, Kay Hall, who's the CFO. And then we got Rob Bruff, who is over all of marketing. And he is truly a remarkable leader. And he adopted a Black son. And so he also has a personal connection to the Black and African American community. We most recently, our last event that we hosted through this business forum was on allyship. And this is our ultimate goal across all of our 9 employee business forums, is to not just invite employees who identify as being members of these groups, but also inviting allies to come to the table. And for so many of us, overwhelming majority of our employees, we have almost 1,500 employees across Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming, identify as white. And so if we're going to be successful in doing this work, we have to build allyship and make them feel like they are a part of this work too, right? And so the last Employee Business Forum event that we hosted was on allyship, and we had Rob Bruff as one of our panelists. We had Jennifer Smith, who is another just champion. She runs all of ETO. So she's our Chief Information Officer over our Enterprise Technology Office. There are more employees in ETO than there are at Zions Bank. So that's a big role. And then our third one was Peaches, who is one of our inclusion champions in Idaho. And so the 3 of them, vastly different experiences, vastly different upbringings, vastly different roles here at the bank. Each one of them shared with all of us what allyship looks like to them with this particular community. And hearing their personal stories really, just helped everyone who participated in that meeting. We had almost 300 people tune in for this. And it was probably one of the most impactful experiences that we've had here to date, at Zions Bank since we launched all of these forums earlier this year. So, in terms of advice for someone serving as an executive sponsor, I just go back to those 3. I listen, I learn, and I lead, and continuously finding ways that you can support the community. First and foremost, listening is so important so that you can hear what ways they would prefer you to support them. Sometimes we step in these spaces, this is what they need. When in fact, you got it all wrong. Actually, no, what we need is this, right? And again, seeing the value and the different perspectives and experiences that other people and different communities bring to the table.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate you giving me a little bit of personal advice for my own roles. That's very helpful for me.
Pleasure.
Is there anything that you had wished I had asked or that I missed in the conversation today, or do you think we covered the bases here? It's a pretty wide-ranging discussion, actually.
Yeah, Jeff, I'm actually really impressed with both of us. We packed in so much content and hopefully valuable information for your listeners into 30 minutes.
30 minutes. Well, Sui, I'm usually accused of talking fast, but I think you kept up today, so I don't think I set the land speed record.
Oh, my gosh.
Got a lot of content in there from your, listen, learn, lead framework to your diversity, equity, and inclusion equation, which I'm going to have written out in the notes because I think that was great. And a lot of the conversations about what you guys are doing. I do have 3 questions that I typically ask at the end of the podcast, and I'll modify one a little bit given the context. But here they are. Number 1, what's the best piece of career advice you've ever gotten? And you've had an interest in, not all in banking, so you've been in a lot of different places. What's the best career advice you've gotten?
Great question. I would say finding ways to partner with unlikely allies.
Unlikely partner. See, this is very different than I get from most of my banker guests. So this is, we're breaking new ground. Do you have an example of that? That's a great concept.
Yeah, so it's like me as a woman of color with a background in politics, partnering with a white male conservative in the financial services industry like a Scott Anderson. Together, when you find commonality across those differences, that's a win. It's always opportunities for growth and expansion, expanding that circle of trust. So, in the political arena, it's like you partnering from the most liberal, leader to the most conservative, bringing them together when they can find commonality and a way to align their efforts, that's a win, right? So that's always been my my little piece of advice that I've taken from so many of my poli-sci professors.
I like there we go, poli-sci 101. It's great. I love that piece of advice. So
Yeah.
my second question is usually your best advice you've heard for consumer lending. But let me set that one aside since you're not historically a consumer lender, and ask what's the for someone interested in becoming a better ally or starting or kind of sustaining more real DEI efforts within their institution. What's the best advice you have for someone who's interested in really making a difference in that way within their own institution?
In sustaining the efforts?
Absolutely.
Well, one important thing is it needs to go straight to the top, right? It needs to come from the top. And I have developed DEI strategies in both the public and private sector. The way you build out a successful strategy is look at the power structure in which you're operating in. In the public sector, the power lies with the people, right? In a democratic society, you organize, mobilize, voterize people, and that applies pressure to government, and that's when we start seeing policy change, right? In the private sector, the power lies at the top, right? The C-suite, the CEO. And if you're going to be successful, you need to engage them, get them on board, and then you have the trickle-down effect. So one thing that I negotiated when accepting this role is I had to report directly to the number one, right? This had to be top of mind. The leadership had to be leading out on it in order for us to be successful. And it's also a faster way for someone like me who's so new to the bank to build the social capital that is needed to move the needle in shifting culture. And so that's a critical element to building a successful strategy. Oftentimes this role is buried in HR or buried in learning and development, or is buried in somewhere where it's not deeply integrated into the business strategy. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a business imperative. And if you move forward with that philosophy and approach, you will be successful.
That's great advice. I like that. And then, so here's my last question is, what is one bold prediction for the future?
Oh my gosh.
The only person who has not managed to come up with something was my co-founder who just totally blanked. So, I'm sure you'll do better than that. But I always like to see if this way I can invite you back in a year and see if you were right or if you were wrong.
For the future, oh my gosh, that's a tough one. I'd like to see the end of the pandemic.
Fingers crossed.
Right? I mean, I would love to, how people are talking about going back to life as normal or as usual. I don't even know what that looks like anymore, but hopefully I'll get to engage with my colleagues face to face at some point.
Have you been virtual? Have you been virtual since you started? Have you been like in office? Have you guys been there, or has it been mostly, Zoom since you got going? 7 months you've been there, all pandemic.
Yeah, no, great question. I'm one of those people that is like an in-office person because I like to separate home life with work life, and I'm just much more in the zone when I do that. So I have actually been in the office since day one, December 1st. But overwhelming majority of our employees have still been working virtually, but we have rolled out a plan to bring everybody back in office by Labor Day. So we're kind of one of those organizations that being bold and, pretty clear about expectations. And yes, we want our employees back in the office, and it absolutely does impact performance. I would definitely support that argument. When you're in the office, you're in the zone. When you're around your colleagues, your teams, you're more accountable. It's just better all around.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're taking measures to make sure everybody feels safe and vaccinations, things like that. So
I hope you're right. I was in my first in-person meeting with a client, and since the pandemic yesterday, and it was.
How did it feel?
It felt amazing, like to be in front of people again in the same room. We'd had a couple internal meetings and things, but I hadn't been out in front of customers and clients, and it felt oddly normal, if that makes sense. Strange and yet normal all at the same time. So it was great.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all those elements of comfortability, safety, come into play. Pandemic has taught us a lot about those elements.
It has, and so has this conversation. I've had a great time listening and learning, and it's going to take me a while to digest all my thoughts. But Sui Lang, thanks so much for joining us. This was, I think, extremely useful and a timely conversation. I really appreciate your sharing your thoughts. My
pleasure, Jeff. And I know we just met like an hour ago, but I feel like we've known each other for years.
That's the way good conversations go.
Exactly. So I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
so
you.
much.